In 2014, Ontario became the first jurisdiction in North America to completely phase out coal-fired electricity for health and environmental reasons. This massive step to reduce greenhouse gas and air-polluting emissions, the equivalent of taking 7 million cars off the road, was the result of a more than 15-year public advocacy campaign. This video features insights from 3 key players in that campaign.
The whole coal plant campaign for me came from research that at the time I was doing on a climate change strategy. We were looking at air quality issues. I was doing work on mercury pollution and toxic chemicals, and literally looking at what were all of the sources of those different kinds of chemicals and pollutants. And then when I saw that coal plants were one of the most significant sources of all of these things, rather than doing the old style, have a campaign on climate change, have a campaign on smog and acid rain and mercury, it just made sense to me that, well, let's just go after the source, which is coal plants. And I think a lot of people thought that was a bit of a crazy and perhaps unlikely thing to accomplish, but I think we put together the evidence on why it could work in Ontario. And I think there are a few really important things which frankly make Ontario a little different than some other jurisdictions that are trying this right now. So, first and foremost, we didn't mine coal in Ontario. So it wasn't as though we had an active industry that was employing people to mine coal. In fact, we were importing coal from Alberta in the US. So we could justify that we were moving more to energy self-sufficiency by getting off of coal. I think second, in Ontario, the coal plants were all pretty old. The newest one, Nanticoke, I think was commissioned in like 1975 or something. And I think too, we had at the time, I think there was just a growing sense of, increasing air pollution and smog and a feeling that we actually had to make some progress on some of these issues in Ontario, and a government that was willing to listen to that message.
People had sort of a worry in the back of their brain that something wasn't right with the environment and the way it was, and air pollution maybe, and things in general, but they couldn't find a place to focus on it. And when we gave them a place to focus on it and a real issue, they just came to full attention on it and really did pay attention.
There was simple messaging that the coal's dirty, coal kills, coal causes smog, coal causes asthma attacks, coal is a dirty 19th century fuel that has no place in 21st century Ontario. So what we did was we demonized coal, and we had a receptive market for that, because people in Ontario already disliked coal. When we started out, the majority of people didn't even realize that we had dirty coal-fired power plants. But there was this belief in Ontario that coal was very dirty, and so we had to get the message out that the coal plants were here in Ontario still, and they were a major source of pollution. And so, our key message was that what we need to do is phase out 5 dirty coal-fired power plants to get a dramatic reduction in air pollution. And we knew that we could, if we could phase out the dirty coal-fired power plants, we'd get a dramatic reduction in all the major air pollutants in Ontario. The smog-causing pollutants, the cancer-causing pollutants, the acid rain-causing pollutants, emissions of mercury and lead, which are neurotoxins, and the greenhouse gas emissions. We knew we could get a dramatic reduction. We knew we'd get it at a low cost by switching to natural gas. We could do without any lifestyle changes. And so we saw that there was this opportunity to get a big reduction for low cost, no lifestyle changes. So it should be something that will be attractive to politicians and the people of Ontario. Well, we got a huge boost in 1998, 1 year after we were established, when the Ontario Medical Association had a big press conference in downtown Toronto, And the president of the Medical Association declared that air pollution was a public health crisis in Ontario. And as a result of the Ontario Medical Association saying that, it was a very credible statement, and the politicians had to find a solution to this crisis that the OMA had identified. And then so we were able to come along with the solution, phase out the dirty coal plants to solve the air pollution public health crisis.
Well, the health impact of air pollution was pretty clear when you looked at the literature, but it was impossible for a normal person to understand that because it was inaccessible to them. So what we decided to do was make that health impact story real. And what we did is we made it real for people in their daily lives, in their workplace, if they were ill or if they had ill relatives, and in the hospital and so on, right through the spectrum. People always kind of felt that it was other people who were affected, but it wasn't other people. It was them, it was their families, it was their neighbors, it was their relatives, it was everybody in their community. And I think that caught people a little off guard. And we were very careful to be conservative as we went through it, but quite frankly, the numbers were quite stunning.
We focused the campaign on health issues. So, it's fun now looking back and having everyone say, well, this was the single biggest climate change action in North America, which technically it is, but climate change was really downplayed throughout this campaign. I mean, we talked about climate change, but first and foremost, I think was the recognition that, and you have to remember this is going back 15 years ago or so, there were still people debating whether climate change was happening. It was a divisive issue, certainly wasn't a motivator for policymakers, certainly wasn't a motivator for the public, but by having a campaign focused on health, and in particular recognizing that it was the Ontario Medical Association's leadership in delivering the health message. The turning point for me in the campaign was really when the Ontario Medical Association came out with the numbers on how many people in Ontario die prematurely because of air quality problems. And I forget if it was 1,600 or 1,800 was the number, but I do remember that almost every newspaper in Ontario had that number in big, bold numbers on the front page. And that was, we sort of had this idea that if we talk more about health, it might be successful, but it wasn't until we saw how tremendously effective the OMA's work on this was, and in particular, identifying very specifically, first of all, how many people are being harmed by coal, and then the second big one was when they started to put a cost number on what the cost to the healthcare system, the cost basically to taxpayers was of the health effects of coal. So those two things are huge.
But we looked at some of them and said, some of these places have got to be cleaned up. The problem was that when you began to do that, people in industry or politicians would say, well, we know it's bad for health, but on the other hand, it's very expensive to clean up. We don't know if we can do that. So on the other hand, we knew as physicians it was very expensive to treat all these illnesses, wherever they were being treated. And it was expensive for people who were just losing work and never saw the healthcare system. So we thought, well, if we actually get some numbers on the effects to the healthcare system and to people's lives, then what we have is we have the costs of injuring people and hurting people through air pollution, and we have the costs of a cleanup, and now we've got two parts of costs. We can have a focused debate about it. Very often we ask politicians or industry or people or whomsoever to take actions going forward which will affect them, and we don't paint a full picture for them. And that's not fair, asking people to make a decision on the basis of partial pictures. And so I think whenever you can flesh in another part of it and fill it in and say, okay, now let's have a debate about this, especially for people who understand the other side of the spectrum, and then put them together, now I think that's the best way to make public policy and for people to make up their own minds.
I think there's a lot that we can learn from the coal phase-out campaign in Ontario. I think first it's important to be aware of why the conditions in Ontario were quite ripe for this campaign. So, I'm not necessarily a big fan of replicability for the sake of replicability. Things happen in particular regions at particular times, usually because the conditions are right for them to happen. But there are certainly ways in which the campaign ran that for other jurisdictions would be really important. So, being really rigorously focused, having quite a clear sense of what the alternatives are. So being able to map out how you replace coal, what's the timeline, what are the alternatives, what are the costs of the alternatives, making it very rigorous, very pragmatic, make it feel real and doable, and then figuring out who it is you're trying to influence and what messages they need to hear. And the overall campaign was successful, I would say, for three main reasons. I think, first of all, Jack Gibbons and his persistence was extraordinary. Jack was so focused, so smart, so clear in terms of what he was trying to accomplish. I'm not sure I've ever seen a campaign run with such clarity and persistence as what Jack brought to the Clean Air Alliance. I think second was the idea that it was an alliance. Jack did a very good job of bringing in a diverse group of people, and in a way that I actually really admired, that maybe not everyone always does, is it was an alliance, not a consensus organization. It was Jack's organization with a whole bunch of people behind Jack. That's how I see it anyway. And I think that's what worked well. So it wasn't a bunch of people in a room debating this strategy versus that strategy. You're basically either you're behind Jack's strategy or don't bother signing on. I would really encourage people to look at how Jack structured the campaign. It was very lean, like a remarkably low budget effort. I've seen other environmental campaigns with with many times the resources and not nearly the success, because it was too much effort to get too many people involved and make too many people either feel happy or part of it or accommodated. Jack's kind of ruthless perseverance, what I think was a really interesting model.
When you're up against very powerful opponents, which we were up against Ontario Power Generation. When we started out, it was called Ontario Hydro. It was the biggest it was one of the biggest corporations in Canada, one of the biggest electric utilities in North America. So they were a powerful opponent, as was the unions that represented their workers, the Power Workers Union. And also we were up against the large industrial consumers that only cared about lower electricity rates and weren't willing to pay an extra penny to get a reduction in air pollution. And so to beat those powerful opponents, you had to have more than just a good idea. You had to be able to demonstrate to the politicians that there was strong public support for it. So that's why we built up a strong coalition, a very broad-based coalition, to show the politicians that it also made good political sense.
There was always really clever communication support and really great, smart communications that accompanied the campaign. And we often forget when we're doing these campaigns that ultimately they're about communications, and if you can't communicate with clever messages, with humor, with points that are relevant to the average person, you're just not going to succeed in a campaign. And far too often we see communications coming out of these kinds of campaigns or the environmental community that that's either too dry or too technical or too boring or really just doesn't engage the average person. So there was always really a great communications component that I think helped push the campaign over the top.
Well, the biggest setback occurred in 2006 when the McGuinty government broke their promise to phase out dirty coal by 2009. And not only did they break the promise to phase out coal by 2009, but they didn't set a new date. They claimed they were still committed to a coal phase out, but they had no date. And they just said, well, we're going to allow we're going to ask the Ontario Power Authorities to suggest when we should phase out coal by. That was a huge setback because we had lost the commitment to a 2009 date, and the Ontario Power Authority was not sympathetic to a coal phase out. So we had no confidence that they would come up with a new and acceptable date. And then, so the broken promise was made in June 2006. And then in August, a by-election was called in the Parkdale High Park riding because Gerard Kennedy had resigned to run federally. And that had been a seat which Kennedy had won by, more than 60% of the vote. And so we made the coal phase out, the broken promise, a big issue in that campaign. We focused on Nanticoke, the biggest air polluter in Canada, and its serious negative consequences for the people of Toronto. We made a pamphlet especially for that campaign. We hired an organizer to organize volunteers and go door to door our pamphlet. And as a result, the Liberal candidate lost. The NDP candidate won. It was a huge upset. All the candidates, except for the Liberal candidate, had endorsed a phase out of coal burning at Nanticoke by 2009. So, that was a big setback to the Liberals. They paid a price for breaking their promise. And then we continued to put the pressure on to show that we could achieve a coal phase out by 2009 at a very, very low economic cost. And as a result, in August 2007, Dalton McGuinty issued legally binding regulations that required a complete coal phase out by 2014.
I thought Jack also was brilliant in not relying on any one political party as well. So rather than making this a kind of a divisive and partisan issue, Jack very cleverly and successfully got all the three major political parties to support this campaign. But at the time when Dalton McGuinty was elected and the Liberals had a commitment in their platform to phase out coal, it wasn't a shallow commitment. The government really stepped up. There was, the need certainly to keep the pressure on, but I think there were certain people in the government that were very committed to this idea, and I know the Premier himself was very committed to this idea, and without that kind of leadership, it would not have been possible to have this campaign succeed in the way it did.
For an in-depth look at how Ontario's coal phase-out was achieved, visit cleanairalliance.org/coal.